Welcome to the Learn, Grow, Teach, Parent podcast. All right, welcome back to the podcast. I am here again with Jamie York. How are you today?
Doing great, Mark. Thank you. Having a nice fall here in western Colorado. We kind of live near the desert, and I know other places around the country have been inundated with a lot of rain, but it's been very sunny and beautiful here. Life wedged between the mountains and the desert. But yeah, having a good fall. Looking forward to getting into some snow in the coming months. But yeah, doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. That's also foreign to me because, our weather changed by 1 or 2 degrees. Yes, it got a little bit wetter, but it just seems like another summer day here in Miami. I don't know what the equator looks like from space, but I can tell you that we seem to be very close to it.
Yeah, very nice.
So we wanted to have a little bit of a chat. I know that today's focus was talking a little bit about homeschool and homeschool parents and, why the Academy has been so successful helping homeschool parents in their quest to bring math to young minds. I think it's important for everyone to know, hey, at what grade does the Academy start and how high does it go up? And if you can just tell us a little bit about that, maybe we can focus the conversation a little bit from grade to grade.
Sure. Well, to answer that last question very briefly, the Academy does start in 5th grade. Part of my philosophy with math education is that really in the early grades, it shouldn't be focused on doing a lot of what I refer to as procedural skills. So in those grades, let's just say 2 through 4, they shouldn't be really focused on what often is done, which is spending a lot of time sort of grinding through procedural stuff such as carrying and borrowing and long division, multiplication, a lot of fraction work. Most all of those things in my curriculum, through a Waldorf lens, is really introduced in those earlier grades, but we don't really start practicing it very much until grade 5. So in those early grades, it's just playful, and we encourage homeschool parents or people that are in an in-person Waldorf school, for instance, to really just be playful with the kids. And that's grades 1 through 4. And then in grade 5, we start to say, okay, we've been introduced to a few of these things, such as fractions, long multiplication, long division. Now let's really, gently, not to torture the poor student, but to make it still playful. But okay, let's practice a little bit more of those skills in grades 5 and 6. So that's really when it begins. I did want to reflect on, something else that you said, and I've just been thinking a lot after my travels. I left my Waldorf school, my in-person Waldorf school in Boulder, Colorado. Shining Mountain is the name. I left there in 2017 and decided to travel, and that was really eye-opening for me. And so at this point, I've given math workshops to Waldorf teachers in 22 different countries. I've been very fortunate to do that, and I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast, but just this eye-opening experience that, wow, I do feel that here in the U.S. that we have so much more freedom that is typical in most any other country. Especially Western countries, they tend to still be locked into this educational model that's really, I think the essence of it is really very outdated. It's something that to some degree was designed for preparing factory workers, obedient employees, if you will, and it really wasn't geared to what's needed today, and that is creativity. And so this possibility of creativity isn't going to come through a standardized curriculum. It's not going to come through sort of high stakes testing and that sort of thing that's happening more and more in this country. But it's so completely dominant in other Western countries. And in the U.S., we do have the possibility, I think, through the freedom that we have, the ability for, in many situations, certainly for homeschoolers, we've got this incredible opportunity to design a curriculum that's really going to meet our own child and to really cultivate creativity in a way that I think is very exciting. And so, that's what my Math Academy is largely geared around, is this idea of supporting that effort of homeschool parents to, try to create a math curriculum to try to help to develop the students' thinking in the right way, but very much geared towards that one student.
Well, let me peel back two things. Two things came to mind as you were talking. The first one was that you're talking about creativity and how creativity is important. I'm assuming some of it is how you can creatively teach math, but also just how to have creativity in the act of doing math might be something you can tell me a little bit more about.
Yeah, I mean this whole idea, creativity in mathematics. I think for most people that sounds quite foreign, and I think we did speak earlier about this idea, and it's a radical thought that math is an art, right? That math is an art, and it doesn't mean that all aspects of the math classroom would be artistic or creative, because certainly there is a balance, and there should be a balance between doing skills work and then that creative aspect. But I think what I'm advocating for is a little bit radical, because usually it's all skills, and so to carve out time to really allow for puzzles and problem solving and all of that sort of thing. And that's what really brings that about. I mean, if we really ask what is creativity, it's really it's being immersed. It's creating this vessel, if you will, of opportunity, where a student is actually kind of guiding their own path, right? There's almost like a little bit of a destiny thing there. It's like, which way should I go? And so that creativity comes from the student ultimately making a decision, and what path should I take. And to some degree, and it's more complicated than this, but it's an analogy that I think is somewhat useful. You can imagine being in a labyrinth or a maze, and you come upon, constantly you're coming upon choices. Okay, I'm coming to a junction. Do I go left or do I go right? Do I take this path or do I take this path? And to some degree, in true problem solving, because that's, I think, part of the creative process in mathematics. True problem solving is when you are not sure what route to take. Now, this is completely counterintuitive, or certainly contrary to our normal mathematical experience that you may remember when you were a student, where the teacher said, okay, here's a problem and this is what you do. And so your whole experience as a math student, predominantly is, you're on a homework assignment, you're looking at a homework problem or a test problem, you're trying to recall what you're supposed to do. This is in complete contradiction to the true problem solving experience, where you're given this situation and you have no idea what to do because you've never seen it before. And so you're trying to figure things out. So in this labyrinth, you may try one path, see where that goes. Well, that didn't work out. You come back, you try something else. Of course, that's kind of a two-dimensional image. And in many ways, problem solving is sort of three-dimensional or n-dimensional. It's just like there are so many possibilities, and you're, to some degree, trying to channel, some higher connection or something that will inspire you. I love this idea of intuition. We spoke about that earlier. This idea of inspiration and intuition, and this idea that suddenly you have this idea that you don't even know where it came from. And that creates this new possibility. So you take that path and that turns out to be something that's really helpful. So I think that is part of the creative process. You think about that, and I know, Mark, you're certainly very steeped in music and music education, and what makes it possible for somebody to create a new piece, a new song. And I think there's something in line with mathematics there, or as an artist, where did you have an idea when you created this artistic piece to do this particular thing? And so I think that's what, certainly I'm advocating for, and other math teachers in the world. There are many, it may not be the majority for sure, but who realize that we need to awaken this creative possibility in mathematics. And this is, in many ways, this is the ultimate place where the human being is creative. I think is through thinking. Ultimately, there's a thought process, I think, and again, I'm not an artist, or maybe some people listen to that and say everyone's an artist. Okay. But I don't think of myself in that way. But I think there is this, with all of these different aspects of human creativity, there's an element of the freedom of thinking that really that is engaged there, that I think makes mathematics and any artistic activity really exciting.
That's true, and it's also very similar. I love the labyrinth metaphor because it does a couple of different things. It says that there are choices in where you're going, and that part of arriving at that choice is you have to be thoughtful. But also, I like the word creative because you are to create something, to make something, whether it's to make something of your life, whether it's to make a piece of art, whether it's to make a decision. You have authorship. So it gives agency to young minds that say, well, I can produce the answer. And the answer, although has a value, a mathematical value, not all math is something adding up, dividing, or subtracting to something. And I think that's the vision that young kids have. And as you get deeper into problem solving and you realize that, well, the future of all of us is AI in some way. And in some way, AI is going to do the work that math used to do. However, you still have to ask the right question to get something valuable out of AI. And I think this is somehow metaphorical or at least allegorical to what you're proposing, which is why it's so of this time, Jamie. But
Yeah,
you're
it really is, and it is curious. I mean, we could go down this whole road about talking about AI, and I'm not necessarily an expert in that realm,
right.
but it is a curious thing. Our whole educational system, in a way, has, I guess, to be really crass and perhaps brutally critical of our educational system. Our educational system has really been training is probably a good word, training these young beings to actually be very robot-like in their existence, to just do these steps, follow this through, and it's really the antithesis of creativity. And with AI, yeah, I think you're right. There are going to be, as it has, this is not, in some ways, it's not a new thing. This whole mechanization of human work and mechanization um, of our whole industrial world, et cetera, has been happening for more than a century. Um, and so this is just, in a way, kind of the next step. What is the next thing that the world of technology can replace human work with? But still, this need to have true human thinking, which ultimately is creative. And I know some people may disagree with this, but it will never be able to be done by a machine. So there's this whole extra element of true human thinking, which I would argue, and that's perhaps debatable as well, has this whole spiritual element to it that a machine cannot have. And so that's really what's needed. And education is changing. The needs of our world are changing quickly. And I think absolutely more than ever, creativity is what's needed in true thinking. How do we develop true higher level thinking, not just imitative thinking? That's really what's needed. And mathematics is one of the ways to do this.
Yeah, I see that in your course as well. I remember a few moments ago I said there were two things that came to mind. The other one was, uh, this antiquated model of teaching, this one teacher to many students. In some cases, it could be a class of 10, it could be a class of 30, it could be a class of 40, but it's still one to many, and that is what's antiquated, because the world today, I think, maybe I'm old fashioned, maybe I'm a classicist in some way, but I do believe that tutoring is more powerful than lecturing. And what your academy does is it really allows for that tutor relationship to build, even though you're online and even though you have other ways of mitigating that online quality, you're still honestly tutoring one to one. Do you think that there's an impact that you're minimizing by not really highlighting that in your academy?
As you speak, I think what comes to mind for me is that there is something of a balance here, for sure. And so certainly in my academy, and I do feel there's a place for a good lecture where the students are hopefully in a somewhat interesting and inspirational way, they are encountering new content that's delivered to them, by by a lecturer, by hopefully somebody who's a master teacher that they can look at and really understand. So that certainly is, that traditional aspect of education is still important. But I think what you're pointing out, which is true, is that we're just out of balance. The typical educational form is predominantly very passive. It's the teacher is up there, the teacher is delivering all the content, telling the students what to do, and then the student is just imitating that, as I said. And so what I'm advocating for, sure, there's absolutely a time, even there are times where I even tell my students, okay, you need to learn how to do this particular thing, and I'm giving them the steps and helping them, guide them along so they can build up their skill base, which is important for their future math studies, etc. But my whole argument is that sure, those skills are important, but it's not everything. We need to carve out time to really allow for that, ultimate human creative experience, and to engage them in what I keep referring to as real mathematics. And that, and part of that is and what makes it difficult. And I think that's partly why, one could ask, well, why have we been doing it this way? Well, I think that the traditional mathematical model, and the traditional educational model for that matter, has evolved as it has because it's fairly straightforward to replicate. So we can standardize things. Okay. And I remember that my first job teaching, well before I came to Waldorf Education, I was at a private boarding school in New Hampshire, and it was a fabulous place, and I enjoyed my relationship with the students. But the curriculum is pretty clear. I was just handed a textbook, and I was just told, get through, this entire textbook. That's what my job was. And it was outlined. It was fed to me as the teacher so that I could feed the students. It was fed to me what the assignments had to be. We are right now. We are on day 58 of the year, and this is the assignment that the students need to have. This is the lesson plan. This is what you need to teach. And everything was really handed to me in that way. And so that is fairly easy to replicate. You can hand that to thousands of teachers. And this is, again, the predominant way that things are done, in many, many countries in this world. Everybody's on the national curriculum in that kind of way. And so it's easy to replicate. It's hard to replicate this idea of teaching creatively, so that it's going to be different depending on the teacher, where they're at on day 58. And it's going to be different. I know it's true with me as well. It can be different depending on the group of students, etc. Right? And so what my challenge has been for this Math Academy is, how do we strike that balance? How do we do both? How do we have something that, and I'll be honest, my curriculum is something that does build, right? And I'm on week number such and such, and this is the topic that we're doing. So there is that part that is very, you could say it is very determined and it's going to be the same from one year to the next. But what's not going to be the same is the whole experience that the students have by engaging in the creative work. And that's through this group work that I have the students do. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm giving them ideas of problems, of puzzles, of discovery exercises that they can engage in. And where they go with that is going to vary quite a bit depending on the group of students. And so it's really striking that balance. And I love that word balance. And I keep coming back to it again and again in my life, because I think that's also something that's needed for our time.
Yeah, I like that
creativity
too.
and then balance.
I stand corrected. You did a good job of correcting the inaccuracy of how I worded things. And ultimately, the idea of bringing balance to a homeschooler, to homeschool curriculum, has greater flexibility, because obviously parents are homeschooling because they want freedom. They want freedom from. But the freedom to is, I think, where you fill in the gap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does make sense. And, this whole idea of balance. You could look at, I see this too. I'm not the only person, the only math teacher that's come up with an alternative curriculum, right? And so there are some curricula that go to an extreme where it's like, okay, we want nothing to do with skills whatsoever. Everything's going to be kind of a problem solving exercise, and in some curricula, you can imagine students are just, let's just see where the students want to go. And we'll have, it's completely unguided. There's no direction, complete freedom. The students will determine what they're going to do, etc. So I'm, again, trying to strike this balance. I think this is what can be very helpful for the homeschool parent is I'm providing that structure. Structure is part of that balance. And so I provide the structure because hopefully I've got a little bit of wisdom after it seems like hundreds of years of thinking about what should the students actually do and so forth. So I've developed this curriculum ultimately that starts in grade 1, although the Math Academy starts in grade 5, all the way through grade 12. Right. And so I'm providing the assignments and the content and how to deliver the content and all of that sort of thing, which can be a huge relief to homeschool parents. Not only the ones, oftentimes we think of a, homeschool parent who's struggling with math because they struggled with math and they're not quite sure of the math content themselves, let alone how to present it. But there are many homeschool parents out there that are extraordinarily talented in all major subject areas, and they could be, very knowledgeable in mathematics and science and all these different subjects. But knowing how to teach it and kind of how one thing builds after the other, week after week after week, can be quite a challenge for many homeschool parents. How to figure that out. And so what I've been able to do is provide some structure and to give them that framework that does allow for this very methodical development of the mathematical concepts, which is important, and in balance with this whole creative aspect. Because I have this, two parallel curriculums. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's the curriculum that I developed when I was in person at in-person schools, where it was, as you might imagine, how does it build from 5th grade to 6th grade and all these different topics? Okay, we're introducing percents in grade 6, and then okay, now it's stepping into grade 7, and that's where percents go. And then in grade 8, this is sort of the culmination of 3 years of percents work. I'm just using that one of many topics as an idea, and then we review it again later, etc. There's that whole aspect of things that I think can be very helpful, that sort of trajectory. But then that second parallel curriculum is not just that. It's, the first one, as I said, is my workbooks. You see that then, and that's what I did in the in-person teaching. But what I didn't do enough of, and it's always easy in retrospect, isn't it? You kind of look back and you go, why didn't I do this years before? It took me a long time to figure it out. But it's through this Math Academy work that it kind of forced me to realize, okay, I really need to practice what I preach. I really need to make sure that these kids are having some very open-ended problem-solving experiences, and that's that extra curriculum, that parallel curriculum, where it allows for that possibility of that labyrinth experience, of that creative experience through the puzzles and discovery and all of that.
Yeah, that's amazingly well thought out, and I saw it play out in real time with my daughter, who was a member of the academy. And as homeschool parents, we fell into that very trap you were talking about, which is, where's my framework? Where's my structure? We didn't even know developmentally, well, what should a child know at 5th grade? What should they know at 6th grade? What should they know at 7th grade? And although that's relative, right, there are standards that you have to consider. And is there a way that you were able to articulate, all right, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, they scaffold, they work together in order to ultimately give you a child that can then go into high school work and navigate it efficiently? Because if the early childhood education to you is one thing, this middle that really starts at 5th grade is another. What do you think that middle ground is, and why is it so successful with the way that you layer those lessons?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? And it's kind of ultimately at the essence of Waldorf education, is this whole developmental approach. And how is it that their thinking should evolve? It's one thing to say, okay, what topics can I teach when? But it's a whole nother level in terms of the the things that need to be considered as a teacher. How do I develop? What is the trajectory of developing this certain kind of thinking? That can be certainly very much of a challenge. What kind of teaching or what kind of learning experience should the students be encountering? That's a very different thing. Let me give an example of that. I like to tell this story of teaching one of my first years of teaching at Shining Mountain Waldorf School, that I was teaching ninth grade and 11th grade at the same in the same year. And so I would go from my ninth grade class to 11th grade class, and both of the classes were quite successful. And then I encountered that my 11th grade students somehow weren't satisfied with what I was doing. And it was kind of a subtle thing. I think they were doing quite well in the course. I had a good relationship with them. By any normal means, one would think that I'm being quite successful. And what I realized was I wasn't teaching them, or I was teaching them as if they were ninth graders. So this is an interesting thing, and forgive me if I repeated this before, but I came to this realization that our modern educational system kind of treats everybody as if they were ninth graders. And it's kind of a strange thing, isn't it? So here it is, you're age 14, you're age 15. So what does a ninth grader really want? What do they need developmentally? And I've had this, it's a curious thing. I do a lot of algebra in ninth grade, and we do introduce it in seventh grade and further in eighth grade, but ninth grade is kind of like, this is the time to really develop their algebraic thinking. That kind of mathematical experience is so appropriate in ninth grade, and any normal ninth grader is really happy with it. A ninth grader is not philosophical, and they really gain a great deal of satisfaction by learning how to solve problems that have a certain level of complexity. And if they really work on those skills throughout the course of the year, it becomes very satisfying to them. Look at these complicated problems that I can solve that just a little while ago I had no idea how to do. It's very empowering to them. And that is the experience that they really enjoy. And to some degree, and that's the way algebra is, they are being, even though I try to guide them through discovering what these procedures are, it's very skills-based, it's very procedural. That kind of experience is not appropriate for young children. But that's ultimately what we often do, is, again, I speak of this procedural skills. It's like, okay, here's how we solve this, and this problem solving. It's not problem solving actually at all, is it? But this sort of very algorithmic approach to doing math problems, I guess is what I would say. And then it's not appropriate for younger children. It is appropriate for ninth graders. And it's also not appropriate for 11th graders or even university students, which often ends up happening. So that same sort of rote isn't even the correct word, but it's this approach. Sometimes I call it we, you approach to teaching. I am going to show you something. Okay, I'm going to deliver this and show you this new skill to learn, right? We are going to practice it together, and then you will master it and be tested. That sort of approach to teaching, to some degree, again, is very satisfying to the ninth grader, because it's like, wow, look at what I can do. Look at what I've learned, right? So I used to give weekly quizzes to my ninth grade students, and it's very satisfying for them because it confirms, wow, look at the progress that I'm making. But it's not appropriate for younger children, and it's not satisfying for older students. And so, that those subtleties about how do we teach, I think, is certainly something that I've tried to weave through my curriculum. Let me give another example. This whole idea of mathematical proof. Some people will say, some mathematicians will say, that the whole purpose of mathematics is this rigorous thinking, and ultimately that is really demonstrated through this approach to doing what we call deductive proofs. So you're not doing real math unless you're really proving what the theorems and the laws that you are encountering. And so that's certainly more of a university level thinking, but we can experience that a little bit in high school, this idea of this developing this logical thinking. So as it often is, you learn about these things kind of the hard way as a teacher, and you're like, "Whoop, that didn't work." So let me give one example of I have this I like doing this mental math, and I think mental math is something for the younger children especially. I think it really, second grade is a very important time to be really having them do to work with numbers in their head, and that develops all the way. I do it up till seventh grade. It certainly could be done further, but as part of that, I do these math tricks, and there's a great amount of joy for the students to learn how to do certain mental calculations. Let me just guide you briefly toward one of them. And so if I say, what is 14 times, let's do 18 times 35. So this is something I might do with seventh graders. 18 times 35. How would you do that in your head? Well, that kind of mental math exercise seems, outrageously difficult. 18 times 35, what could I do? Well, there's a little trick to do that I noticed that the 35 ends in a 5 and the other one's an even number. And so I can double the number ending in 5. So 35 times 18. So I'll double the 35. So that's 70. And then I can balance the fact that I doubled one number by cutting the other number in half. And so I'll cut the 18 in half and I get 9. So 35 times 18 is the same as double the 35, I get 70. Cut the 18 in half, I get 9. So it's 70 times 9, so it's 630. So that sort of thing is very empowering for the students. And that's one of the many tricks. Did you follow that? Yeah,
Oh,
18 times 30,
absolutely.
18 times 35, okay, is the same as 9 times 70, which is much easier. So that's sort of, I call them math tricks. They're calculation shortcuts. It's a great mental exercise for students. I do that especially in 6th and 7th grade. So that I just explained kind of logically how it works. And I would do that with the students as well, and that's appropriate. But sometimes it's not appropriate to give. Sometimes you can actually take the joy out of it by focusing too much on the logic of everything. I'll give you a second example of a calculation shortcut. So there's something called the 11s trick. I can do 11 times 36. 11 times 36. And so what I'll do with the students is I'll say, okay, I want you to do these 5 problems, 11 times 36, and then you'll do 11 times 24, and 11 times just all these different problems with 11 times something. And then I just say, do it out the long way, long multiplication, and then look at your answers and see if you can discover what the trick is. And almost without exception, the students will discover this magical little trick for the 11s, for multiplying times 11. And so if I do the original one that I said, 11 times 36, the trick becomes, this little magic trick, if you will, is what we do is we separate the 2 digits that we're multiplying 11 by, so 36, we separate that out, and then we put in between that the sum of those 2 digits. 3 plus 6 is 9, so we get 396. And the students just love that. It really brings them great joy. Look what I discovered. I discovered this magic trick for math and how to do this calculation shortcut. Fabulous. For me to go and then logically explain it kills it. For a sixth grader, it kills it. And so again, what I'm getting at is there's a different need for students at different ages. So for a 6th grader, it's actually, I'd say it's detrimental. It's just you're killing it by trying to give a logical explanation. But for a 10th grader or 11th grader, that may be helpful. I'll give one more example if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. These are terrific lessons.
So in terms of geometry, the Pythagorean theorem is such a fabulous thing. And it's a fabulous thing because through the lens of the Pythagorean theorem, we can have the students really experience quite a bit of the development of their own thinking in time. And so I find a way, at least I try to find a way to guide my students in 7th grade toward discovering the Pythagorean theorem for themselves. What does that mean? Well, first of all, if I say the Pythagorean theorem, I'm sure most people listening here immediately just think, it's like this knee-jerk reaction. They can't even help themselves. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. That's what they all think. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Well, first of all, it's not how Pythagoras ever thought of it. That wouldn't even make sense. It's an algebraic formula. So I can get into this whole philosophical thing about, how algebra has become dominant, and we've taken the Pythagorean theorem, which is in essence geometry, and we've basically, removed the geometry and just basically reduced it down to an algebraic formula. But so what I do is I give it to my 7th grade students as a puzzle. And so in the Pythagorean theorem, through the lens of Pythagoras and the ancient Greeks, and up until modern times, it was to picture the Pythagorean theorem. There was actually a mental picture associated with that, and it was a right triangle with 3 squares, a square attached to each side of the triangle.
Hmm.
Normally when we see that, the Pythagorean theorem, we just see a triangle with the sides labeled A, B, and C, a right triangle.
Yes.
The true Pythagorean theorem is a right triangle with 3 squares attached to it. And then it becomes a relationship between the areas of those 3 squares. And so I have the students discover that, and they actually discover it by, I'm not going to get into all the specifics here. I think maybe I have a YouTube video on this somewhere, but there are different proofs of the Pythagorean theorem. But their first experience is they actually get a pair of scissors and they cut out the triangle and the 3 squares, and then they take those 3 squares and cut the 2 smaller ones into pieces, and those pieces of the 2 smaller squares fit inside the largest square. And that's a 7th grade experience. And then we can ask, okay, well, this puzzle that you just did, I didn't tell them it was a Pythagorean theorem in the beginning at all. I then said, well, what does this mean? We just took these 2 smaller squares, and by the way, every student in the class had a different shaped right triangle to begin with, and so they all were working with different squares. But in every single case, the students had a situation where the 2 smaller squares were cut into pieces, and those pieces fit very neatly into the largest square. And then we tease out of that, well, what does this say? What is the mathematical law? And eventually we come to this understanding that it means that if we start with any right triangle, then the areas of the 2 smaller squares added together will equal the area of the largest square. That sounds very different than a squared plus b squared equals c squared, doesn't it? Right? Which I come to, by the way, in 8th grade. But my point is, the point of this, and I think it ties into this question that you asked me, which I can no longer remember what it was. But I will say this, for the 7th grader, that experience of cutting out these little pieces of these squares and putting them in is enough of a proof. No mathematician would look at that and say, well, that's a rigorous proof. It isn't. It was just kind of a little cutout puzzle. And then in 8th grade, I do kind of a little bit higher level thinking of this visual proof of the squares sort of transforming themselves and moving and then fitting into the largest square. That's a different experience of the Pythagorean theorem. And then eventually we fast forward to 10th grade, and then we go back and we look at all these different kinds of proofs. Oh, in 7th grade, I did this with you, this little cutout puzzle. And then in 8th grade, we did this visual proof. And now here we are in 10th grade, and I can show you these other proofs. And then we can talk much more technically, much more rigorously about, well, what proof can we have that's going to be this perfect, sort of airtight, rigorous, deductive mathematical proof, this explanation that nobody could refute of why the Pythagorean theorem is true. But that sort of level of thinking, that need to have a perfect, logical, rigorous proof, is not something that a 7th or 8th grader needs. And to try to push that to a younger child isn't going to be successful. So that's kind of a little bit of the explanation about how the thinking can develop just through the lens of this, one obviously well-known mathematical idea of the Pythagorean theorem, how that evolves over time. And then it becomes a philosophical discussion. Well, why do we need to prove anything? And how did that historically fit into the ancient Greeks? Those sort of things are all really valuable. And I like to think that, these are the sort of things that I've learned through my many years of teaching that I certainly did not know and did not experience when I was a student. I didn't understand the historical background of geometric proofs and all of that. I was just kind of dragged through 10th grade geometry, and that, proving thing after thing after, theorem after theorem after theorem without really truly understanding why I was doing it. But giving that historical context is really helpful. I'm not sure if I really answered your question in the end, but I
Well,
tend
you
to go off in
absolutely,
tangents sometimes.
yeah, you absolutely did. I mean, you should I think what we should really call this is the Jamie York Math Academy experience. Because what you're doing is you're saying you can experience math differently than in the traditional sense without losing any of the value of the traditional sense, which is the learning. But by by not squishing everybody into a ninth grade level, by not forcing someone to see uh, what ultimately became an algebraic expression in Pythagoras to what is originally a geometric one, has an enormous value to the development of that child. It's almost all right. So you're a homeschool parent. You're worried about your child's education. You're worried about your child's experience. Well, the Math Academy has thought out, especially the way you developed this through learning. You said you didn't start out knowing all of these things. You came to know these things, but the end product is that you're very careful about what the child experiences, because experiencing something too soon can ruin the math experience just as much as not experiencing something at all can. Am I correct in this?
Absolutely. And, I like that word experience as well. And I do like to I do like to think that ultimately, what is the most important thing that we're doing here? This Pythagorean theorem in and of itself isn't the most important thing, but it's that experience. It's that it's that learning, it's that journey that they took in learning it, and how did that affect them developmentally? Ultimately, I hope that my students are learning life's lessons here. They are developing as a human being, and through all of the different subjects that they are experiencing. Um, and it's, there's a lot of power in that for sure.
Oh, yeah, 100%. You're a great mentor. And what I mean by that is that not only are you a good tutor to teach mathematics to these age appropriate children, I think you're a good example of what the parent should try to model. In being involved in the academy, would you say there's a secret sauce, or there's some how can the parent be involved that then maximizes the experience for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, the parent involvement is so critical. I often have said that, and we've heard many things like this, it takes a village to raise a child, and all of this. It's all about the development of the child. That is it. And great things can happen, I think. It's to the benefit of the child when the adults in that child's life are kind of working all in synchronicity to try to aid the student's development. That is for sure. But it is, I mean, life is a journey, education is a journey, and those, that's what I'm hoping is through math and many other subjects, this is helping them to develop them in the right way through this journey, and then they're learning lots of life lessons. I want to tie back to something that was said earlier, and this idea of experience. The child should ultimately, in so many different ways, have an experience through the course of their years of childhood going into early adulthood. They should really be experiencing a similar journey to what humanity did. So how is it that humanity developed its mathematical thinking, if you will? How is it that the world of mathematics developed over millennia in different cultures, etc.? But how did that thinking evolve? And that's an interesting thing. So I was just giving that example of the Pythagorean theorem. Humanity went through a similar thing, you could say. That initial idea, I mean, this is perhaps, looking at it historically, how did the Pythagorean theorem evolve? And there's evidence that cultures before the ancient Greeks knew of that relationship of the squares onto a triangle before, or the relationships between the three sides of a right triangle. They may have known about that in some way before the ancient Greeks, but it was the ancient Greeks who felt that need to prove, to show, this whole philosophical endeavor of proof That's a whole thing right there. And then, and I like to think this, that was kind of the 10th grade experience. So the child has developed in a way, you could say, in their thinking, in their consciousness. They have developed in a similar way up to 10th grade that the ancient Greeks had. But I think our society oftentimes gets stuck there, it never goes further. We're kind of stuck as a society, and I think I spoke about this before, in this idea of logical, deductive, black and white kind of thinking. It's either true or it's false, and how powerful that is to then go beyond that. And to getting really into this modern world where truth isn't quite so black and white. And so to take that Pythagorean theorem, and it's just such a profound thought, and I know this ties into what we were speaking about in the previous podcast, but for the 11th grader then to look at it and say, well, in other geometries, the Pythagorean theorem actually isn't true. That's just a wild thought, that this idea of a squared plus b squared equals c squared, whatever, however you want to frame it, the Pythagorean theorem isn't true. Or just to use another example, the angles in a triangle, they add to 180 degrees. Well, that's true in Euclidean geometry, but it's not true in other non-Euclidean geometries, we call them, that the angles in a triangle could actually add to more than 180 degrees. I'll just give a simple example for the listener because it's kind of fun. It's like, what? How could the angles in a triangle be more than 180 degrees? Well, in the realm of spherical geometry, which is a very simple example, start at the North Pole, draw a triangle on the Earth from the top of the North Pole all the way down to the equator. However you got there, just go straight down to the equator, make a left turn. So then you are heading, if I'm getting this right, east. You head east along the equator line, 1/4 of the circumference of the equator, and then stop, make another left turn, go back to where you started up to the North Pole. You just drew a very large triangle. Those 3 lines, as you were walking, it certainly seemed very straight, but they were on a sphere. A spherical triangle, as I just said, those were 3 90-degree angles that we just drew. So that particular triangle, the angles add together to be 270 degrees, right? And that's just a simple example. There are other types of geometry where we don't even talk about angles. It's just no longer is it a valid thing to say the angles in a triangle add 180. So that kind of thinking is much more of an 11th grade, higher level kind of thinking. It's this kind of more flexible, almost paradoxical, just more philosophical kind of thinking that is so powerful for our 11th grader and 12th graders to experience, which is certainly something that I try to do with my students that I certainly never encountered, even in university as a math science major.
Yeah, I think you run into the danger of modern education is that it looks at it similar to what the homeschool parent does when they say, okay, we're going to homeschool, so I don't want my kid to fall behind. Let me put them somewhere on this ladder so that at least I know that they're okay. When in reality, there's so much more to the idea of what's right for the child. It isn't necessarily what they know as much as how they got there, what they experienced along the way. And I think you make an excellent point. You know that I believe in classical education. To me, any topic that you bring up to a child, at one point there was either a Greek or a Roman or maybe somebody in the Middle East that was struggling with it and discovered what we now know to be truth. But they didn't know it. And part of the reason why they're notable in history is that they took that journey. So why rob our own children of that experience, of the ability to come to these conclusions? And I think I'm beginning to understand what you mean by being creative, because we didn't get there unless these people were creative, right?
Yes, and ultimately, of course, teaching is very much a creative art. But these words that we're tossing around here, they're important words. This idea of balance and experience and creativity and all of this. And for the homeschool parent, oftentimes we just have this idea that, well, okay, this mathematical journey is all about just learning stuff, right? And it's just this
Right.
knowledge. And that is, and again, I want to emphasize that, yeah, it's very easy to become critical of that. And I am very critical of that approach if that it's just exclusively just skills and so-called knowledge that we're gaining. But this idea of having this balance of doing both. So yes, we do want to build this knowledge base. We do want to build these skills, but so as a homeschool parent, sure, there are lots of books or workbooks and so forth that will help you to do that. But what's going to allow you to also at the same time in parallel develop what I would argue to be even the more important thing, which is developing the thinking, the creativity, and all of that. And that's perhaps more challenging. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to strike that. That's what I referred to earlier as these two parallel curriculums. One is developing the skills and the knowledge, and the other is developing the creativity and the thinking and all of that. And they're both equally important. And of course, there are lots of homeschool parents out there that have that mathematical knowledge and so forth, but to try to actually, which is what I dedicated 30 years of my life to, is developing this whole curriculum, so that one thing builds after the other in both of those parallel curriculums. That's, I think what I can offer to the homeschool parents is just, oh, this is something you can plug into and then allow your child to develop, with your guidance, of course, and it's always going to be individual, but they can develop in these ways that are so important.
Yeah, this is a wonderful thing. I think you've made a great argument to why homeschool parents should start the academy. You've made a terrific argument as to why you keep going, because you're going to layer this learning. You're going to continue it and bring the experience to an age appropriate level, and that the discovery will be beneficial to the entire family. It will be beneficial to the parent. It will be beneficial to the child. But I'm curious, because you've run this academy now for at least since the pandemic. So what are we talking about now? 3, maybe 4 years. And what has been the best feedback that you've received from people who have taken the course, the classes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. This is our 5th year of the academy. We had the good fortune. It's kind of surreal. I mean, the pandemic seems like way in the distant past, and yet it seems like just yesterday, doesn't it? But we had the good fortune of starting the academy 6 months before the pandemic actually took over, as you might say. So, yeah, it's repeat that question again. I just lost it.
Yeah, no, I stand corrected again. Jamie, you've been correcting me the entire podcast, and I appreciate it.
No, I don't mean that.
No, you know what I mean. So, no, the question was, so what kind of feedback have you gotten from parents that hey, you took it to heart. You said, all right, it was worth doing this because of this response I got from a student, a family member, someone.
Yeah. Okay. The feedback question. Yeah, it's a good one. The first thing I would absolutely say is that the Math Academy is not for everybody. It certainly isn't. It's a lot of math. It is not the easy path at all. Right. It's really, the Math Academy is for parents who are looking for, I would say, results. They are looking for their child to become excited about math. They're looking for their child to develop their mathematical thinking and skills, but it's not the easy path. It's an hour of math every day. Now, we do have some families that choose to self-pace it and they're not involved with the group work. But again, that insight that I had at the beginning, that, wow, for this to be successful, it needs to be more than just listening to my lectures, no matter how good they could be. It needs to be more than them just working through skills-based homework, if you will, and to develop, sort of that mathematical part of their knowledge. It needs to be more creative. It needs to involve the puzzles and problem solving, and that needs to be done to help also to develop that human connection. So the students are involved in group work with peers where there's minimal adult involvement. I'm not there for their group work. There could be a parent there that's supervising it, but the kids are doing it on their own. So the feedback sometimes I might get is, this is too much for us, and that I understand, right? And I had one parent once that said, you know what, we just don't want to put that much effort into math. And so they said, we're leaving this, and what we're going to do is this program called Easy Peasy Math. Okay, well, I can say that the Math Academy is not the easy peasy math route. That is for sure. But I think the positive feedback that we've received, and it's the thing that gets me, I think makes me most proud and happy, is when I hear from a parent, and we get this quite regularly, that a parent will say, "My child used to hate math, and now they really have learned to love it," and that's huge. Because ultimately, isn't this true that well, ultimately, I don't know. We spoke about this whole idea of, learning life lessons and developing the human being and all of this. But in terms of oftentimes parents worry, you used the word worry earlier, they worry that their child is not going to be prepared for the world. And that's a legitimate concern, you know. And ultimately, if you're just, you have so much freedom as a homeschooler, if you're like, we'll just learn math as they whatever they feel like doing and so forth, and there's no structure at all, then it's not hard to imagine that that child isn't going to be ready to go off into a university course and thrive in any way. um, but yeah, so we want to make sure that our children, that our students are prepared, that they have the skills that they need. And I spoke earlier um, about the thinking that's necessary to really to be successful in studying in university, or successful in life. But the other thing that I think is so important, and this is, to me, some of the feedback I get, is that the students are now excited, they're engaged in learning, and it's helping to develop their passion for life. And I think this is the most important thing as a parent, as a homeschool educator, or as a teacher, to make sure that our children, that our students are keeping alive that passion and enthusiasm for life. Because if
Wow.
they have this enthusiasm and passion for life and learning, that'll take them very far. And so I think that's some of the best feedback as I get is, again, it sounds awful, and I don't mean to be critical of all those excellent teachers out there in our public schools and private schools in the world that are really doing the best they can, and in many cases being actually quite successful in spite of the curriculum. But a lot of, I'd say, the predominant amount of time, the curriculum these students are basically encountering in their math classrooms is something that's quite soul crushing. It's not something that's helping them to develop their enthusiasm. It's something that they're just getting through at best. In many cases, they're just, managing to get through the system. And so what, we're really hoping to do is to develop this passion and enthusiasm for learning. And one of the best ways to do that, that's a huge question. I mean, the title of my books is Making Math Meaningful. Well, how do you make it meaningful? Well, one of the ways is through those giving them experiences of discovery, giving them experiences of true problem solving, and that feeling of frustration when we can't figure something out, and that feeling of absolute total joy when they figured out something that they struggled with for a while. Though that makes math meaningful. And then the other thing, which I think is very important, is context. What's the purpose of this, right? This path that we're engaging in, this learning path. And I outlined as a very simple example the Pythagorean theorem. When we get to 10th grade and then we look back over what have we done with this one little topic over the last few years, and where is it going into the future? This gives it context and purposefulness, gives it meaningfulness for the students. And so I think all of that is, really important. And that's part of our real goal in the Math Academy. And that's certainly been my goal in developing this whole curriculum.
Well, I think you nailed it. I think you definitely walk the walk. You came up with the idea. It's hitting the mark on all the measures that you've had. It sounds like feedback from parents is something you take to heart, which is important because I think they're not looking for a vendor. They're looking for a collaborator in many instances. And they want this to work out. There's many reasons that people homeschool, but certainly a common one is that they're dissatisfied with how it's going on. So by giving them an alternative, it allows them to, if they thoughtfully look into this, to see if it's a match. I think you make another good point, which is it's not unrigorous. It is something that requires effort, but that you're not going to it's not the type of effort that's like doing 1,000 worksheets or memorizing something by rote, or it's not the type that closes your mind or sucks the soul out of the experience. It really is something that's fulfilling. It fills the experience with meaning and with purpose. And I think you should highly consider changing the title to Jamie York Math Academy Experience.
I like the idea. I like the idea. And what does experience mean? It's not just doing things hands-on. Sometimes we do that, but it's really this deep personal experience of growth, right? And I say to my own children who are now in their 20s that, your education doesn't stop when your formal university or high school education ends, but it's, your job, I like to think up until the age of 28 is to just go out into the world and learn from your life experiences. I
Right.
feel that that's so important.
Very, very much so. This has been another wonderful conversation. Jamie York, you are a treasure. I hope that many, many parents listen to this podcast and that it helps them formulate a plan for going forward. But we should say, and we should talk a little bit, at least in another podcast, that you've expanded the academy beyond mathematics. There are other courses that people can take online. Do you want to briefly just say some of the things that people can learn from your
Well, it'd be
your
great
school?
in particular to talk about science. And, I was thinking just the other day, the courses that we tend to offer are, for the most part, they're extra main lessons, I would say, for science and humanities. And we even offer Spanish classes. And somebody could look and say, well, why do you offer those courses? And the reality is, when we find a teacher who I have confidence in that can really inspire our students, and then when we find such a teacher, then we figure out what they can teach and what they can offer the students. But yes, I'm proud of the fact that we're starting to offer other courses, in particular science, because science is a big challenge as a homeschool parent. Even if you are, for instance, a trained scientist, it's a challenge to be able to have access to the equipment and the laboratories and so forth, to be able to actually bring that to our child in the right way can be a challenge. So we've figured out how to do that. And we're having it's a very different experience because it's a 4-week intensive and it's live every day with the class. And then there's an aspect it's a mix again, a balance of a little bit of recorded content and then live classes and at home science experiments that we have the kids do through kits that we send them and so forth. But yeah, we could talk about that in more detail next time.
I think we should. I mean, because even though you're not doing it in the same way that it's your face and you teaching these lessons in the Math Academy, there's definitely the underlying philosophy doesn't fall far from that,
Yeah,
Newtonian tree.
absolutely. Absolutely. The essence
Very,
of
very good.
science really should be discovery, shouldn't it? And
Oh, 100%.
how much in your own experience as a science student when you were in school did you really feel in any way that you were discovering some of the laws that you were being taught,
Oh,
right,
not
in
at all. I
some way?
mean, I would say that for us, for you and I, we had a little bit of a different education. But what I'm seeing now that I've got daughters that have gone into high school, is that they're memorizing terms, and memorizing terms or defining words, or it's just that by rote memorization that doesn't really do foundationally what it needs to do, which is to say, science is a process by which we discover things, by which we prove things, by
Yeah,
which we uh, and they're just not doing it. They're not doing it because they've lost the ability to teach it in a way that I remember we had Bunsen burners in class. We were burning stuff. We were cooking stuff. We were mixing chemicals. And I don't know if it's the fact that today we're in a litigious society and nobody wants to blow up a classroom, what it is. But I can tell you, it's a lot more fun to make things boil over, blow things up, and figure that out than it is to
absolutely.
go over vocabulary words.
Well, I think I'll end with this thought that what you're talking about a lot is our educational system tends to be very geared towards accumulating knowledge. And I think this is an accurate quote from Einstein that imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. So I like that idea that for Albert Einstein, he would say imagination, and to some degree, I'd say intuition tied into that is what enables us ultimately to make advances in the world. It's really imagination and intuition. And so that ties back to everything that we've just talked about with creativity and all of that. How do we do that? All right, Mark.
There it
Well,
is.
thank you so much for today. And I look forward to
Absolutely.
next time.
Yep. Let's do it again. Bye-bye.
Bye.